Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The geometry classroom at Crewcoo High existed in that particular shade of afternoon light that made everything feel suspended between waking and dreaming. Morty Smith sat in the third row, second seat from the window, watching dust motes dance in golden shafts while Mrs. Henderson's voice traced the familiar paths of parallel lines across the chalkboard. Her words floated through the air like tired butterflies, each theorem a small weight settling on his chest where anxiety liked to gather and grow heavy. He had always been a collector of feelings that didn't belong to him. The way Mrs. Henderson's voice caught slightly on certain words, carrying a small sadness in the spaces between her sentences. The restless tapping of pencils that sounded like tiny hammers against his ribs. The general atmosphere of a room full of teenagers pretending to care about angles and intersections when what they really wanted was to understand why nothing in life seemed to add up the way it did in mathematics. His own pencil traced absent circles in the margin of his notebook, each loop a little more anxious than the last. The familiar tightness was building in his chest again, that feeling like his heart was trying to hold too much of the world at once. This was the feeling that always came before something shifted, and Morty had learned to recognize it, the way sailors recognize the change in wind before a storm, except his storms were gentle things that moved him sideways through the world rather than forward through time. The weight of wondering pressed against his ribs. He wondered if Mrs. Henderson went home to an empty apartment, if she ate dinner alone while grading papers that no one really cared about. He wondered if his classmates felt this same crushing awareness of all the small sorrows that lived in the corners of ordinary moments. The classroom felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Like breathing through wet wool, he closed his eyes and let the feeling wash over him, that strange tingling that began in his fingertips and spread like warm honey through his arms, up his neck, finally settling behind his eyes like a gentle pressure. When he opened them again, he was still in the same classroom, still in the third row, second seat from the window. But something had changed in the quality of the light, in the rhythm of Mrs. Henderson's voice, in the very texture of the air itself. The harsh fluorescent lights had softened into something that breathed with warmth. The scent of old textbooks and floor wax had given way to something indefinable, like the memory of rain on summer grass. Mrs. Henderson was still talking about parallel lines, but now her words carried a different music, softer somehow, like she was sharing a secret rather than reciting a lesson that had grown stale with repetition. You see, she was saying, and her voice held the kind of warmth that made you want to lean closer. Parallel lines are really quite beautiful when you think about them. They run alongside each other through infinity, never touching but never truly apart. There's a companionship in that, don't you think? A kind of eternal friendship that doesn't need contact to be real. Around him, his classmates were actually listening. Sarah Chen had stopped texting and was looking at the board with genuine curiosity. Even Brad Morrison, who usually spent geometry class planning his next skateboard trick, was taking notes with careful attention. The whole room hummed with a gentle awareness that felt like the opposite of sleep, like everyone had suddenly remembered how to be awake in the most peaceful way possible. Morty felt his own shoulders release a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. The knot in his chest loosened, unraveling like a carefully untied ribbon. Here in this subtly altered space, the concept of parallel lines didn't feel like a cruel mathematical truth about things that could never meet, but a gentle reminder that some of the most beautiful relationships exist in the space between connection and separation. He understood, without needing words, that this wasn't a place where problems were solved, but where their sharp edges were simply softened, where the weight of expectations was lifted like morning mist. It was a classroom where every student felt seen and understood, not for their answers, but for their quiet presence. The overwhelming moments, the ones that made his breath catch and his heart pound, weren't just discomfort, they were doorways. And through those doorways he had found a place where things were just a little softer, a little more forgiving. The feeling lasted exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds. Morty had learned to count these slips through the gentle fabric of reality. Then, like a soap bubble popping in slow motion, The moment dissolved, and he was back in the regular classroom where Mrs. Henderson was asking someone to solve for X, and nobody particularly cared about the answer. But Morty carried something back with him. He always did. It was like bringing home a small warm stone from a beach you'd visited in a dream, something you couldn't quite explain, but couldn't bear to leave behind. This time, it was the knowledge that Mrs. Henderson had poetry living inside her, waiting. That somewhere in some gentle fold of possibility, she was the teacher she'd always wanted to be. He looked down at his notebook and realized he'd been drawing something while the shift happened. Not the anxious circles from before, but a series of parallel lines that seemed to dance alongside each other, never touching but somehow connected by invisible threads of understanding. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that looked like his but felt borrowed from somewhere else, were the words, "The space between is where the magic lives." The bell rang, and students began shuffling toward the door, with their usual mixture of relief and resignation. As Morty gathered his things, still feeling the echo of that other classroom, that other possibility, he began to understand something important. These slips weren't accidents or escapes. They were something else entirely. Glimpses of what he would later learn to call the infinite heist, the gentle art of borrowing peace from endless possibilities and carrying it back to the one reality he called home. Walking through the hallways of Crewcoo High, he felt the familiar weight of returning fully to his own dimension, but he was getting better at carrying the warmth back with him, at letting it settle into his bones like sunlight absorbed through skin. Somewhere in this quiet coastal town, he was beginning to sense there were others like him. Others who had learned to slip sideways through the cracks in the world, not to escape it, but to bring back proof that gentleness was always possible, always waiting in the spaces between what is and what could be. The afternoon stretched before him, golden and full of questions he was only beginning to learn how to ask. The walk home from Crewcoo High carried Morty through streets that breathed with the rhythm of a town that had learned to move slowly, where the afternoon light fell through salt-touched air like honey through cheesecloth. His notebook pressed against his hip through his backpack, that strange phrase still warm on the page like ink that hadn't quite dried. The space between is where the magic lives. Each step felt different now, as if his feet were learning to recognize the subtle places where one reality might give way to another, where the familiar could become a doorway to something infinitely gentler. At the corner of Harbour and Main, he paused not because the crosswalk demanded it, but because something in the quality of light made his chest flutter with that now familiar sensation. Mrs. Patterson was tending her flower boxes with the methodical care of someone who understood that small acts of nurturing could be prayers offered to the world. The tingling began in his fingertips, that warm honey feeling spreading through his arms, and before he could think to resist it, the world tilted sideways into softness. Here in this gentle fold of possibility, Mrs. Patterson wasn't just watering flowers. She was having quiet conversations with each bloom, her voice carrying the kind of tenderness usually reserved for lullabies. The petunias seemed to lean toward her words, and when she noticed Morty watching, she smiled with the easy warmth of someone who had never learned to be suspicious of teenagers standing still on street corners. "Beautiful afternoon for noticing things, isn't it?" she called, and her voice carried across the space between them like a bridge made of understanding. The moment dissolved like sugar in warm tea, returning him to his regular corner, where Mrs. Patterson had finished her watering and gone inside. But he carried something back with him, the way you carry the warmth of a campfire in your clothes long after the flames have died. It was the knowledge that somewhere, somehow, kindness was always the first language, and everything else was just translation. Walking the final blocks home, Morty found himself cataloguing these glimpses he'd been collecting without quite realizing it. The slips weren't random, he understood now. They came when his heart felt too full of the world's sharp edges, when the weight of everything he couldn't fix threatened to crush the small space where hope lived. And in those moments of overflow, he would resonate with other versions of his life, like a tuning fork finding its match across infinite distances. He had seen a Morty who lived in a house where his parents still looked at each other with curiosity instead of resignation, where dinner conversations bloomed instead of withered, where love moved through the rooms like light through clean windows. He had glimpsed a Summer whose eyes held deep empathy instead of defensive sarcasm, who would sit beside him on quiet evenings and offer the profound gift of simply being heard. Most tenderly, most impossibly, he had felt the presence of a Rick whose brilliance was tempered with gentle affection, whose words built bridges instead of walls, who might place a warm hand on his shoulder and say, without irony or edge, "You're pretty good, kid." These weren't places he traveled to exactly. They were more like radio stations his heart could tune into when the static of his regular life became too much to bear. And always, always, he returned to his own reality, carrying something back. Not solutions or fixes, but the quiet knowledge that peace existed, that tenderness was possible, that the sharp edges of his world weren't the only truth available. Climbing the front steps of his house, he heard the familiar sounds of ordinary evening beginning. His mother's voice carried from the kitchen, tired but not harsh, asking someone to please remember to put things back where they belonged. The television murmured its constant commentary, and somewhere upstairs, Summer was playing music just loud enough to create a boundary around her private world. These were the sounds of his life, and he loved them even as they reminded him of all the gentleness that lived just out of reach. Standing in the doorway between outside and inside, between the afternoon's discoveries and the evening's familiar routines, Morty felt something shift in his understanding. His strange gift wasn't about escaping this reality or finding a better one to live in permanently. It was about learning to carry the softness back, about becoming a bridge between what is and what could be. Every slip into those sideways worlds was teaching him something about the infinite variations of love, the countless ways hearts could learn to be open. He stepped through the door and into the warm chaos of home, his pocket heavy with invisible stones collected from beaches that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. The weight of these infinite selves, these peaceful echoes, wasn't a burden but a quiet promise. Somewhere in the vast ocean of possibility, every harsh word could be softened, every closed heart could remember how to open, and every family could find their way back to the tenderness they had never really lost, only temporarily forgotten how to speak. The evening stretched before him, golden with the knowledge that peace wasn't something you found, but something you learned to carry, one gentle breath at a time. The next morning arrived with the kind of coastal light that made everything in Crewcoo look like it had been painted with watercolors left out in gentle rain. Morty woke with the echo of that warm bread still lingering on his tongue, Elena's paper bag sitting on his nightstand like a small promise waiting to be kept. He dressed slowly, letting the morning settle around him like a familiar song, and found himself walking to school by a different route, not because he had planned it, but because his feet seemed to understand something his mind was still learning to trust. The path took him past the old maritime museum that doubled as a used bookstore, its windows fogged with the breath of stories that had been waiting patiently to find their next reader. As he paused to look at the display of weathered novels, arranged like a small harbor of words, he noticed someone inside moving between the shelves with the kind of attention most people reserved for prayer or listening to rain. She was about his age, with dark hair that caught the morning light and a way of touching book spines that suggested she was hearing something more than titles. When she looked up and saw him watching through the glass, she didn't startle or look away, but smiled with the easy recognition of someone who had been expecting exactly this moment, at exactly this time. With exactly this person standing in exactly this spot on the sidewalk, the door opened with a small bell's whisper, and she stepped halfway out, still holding a slim volume of poetry that seemed to hum with contentment in her hands. "You're the one who's been borrowing gentleness," she said, and her voice carried the same quality he'd been hearing in his sideways glimpses of other realities, like music that knew how to heal without trying too hard. Before he could wonder how she knew, she continued, "I'm Lena, I work here sometimes. When the books need someone to listen to what they're trying to remember." She held up the poetry collection. "This one's been whispering about parallel lines that dance instead of staying separate. Sounds like something you might understand." The familiar tingling began in his chest, but instead of the overwhelming pull toward another dimension, it felt like recognition, like his heart saying hello to something it had been searching for without knowing it was lost. "I'm Morty," he said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, introducing himself felt like offering a gift rather than apologizing for existing. They walked together towards school, letting the conversation unfold like morning mist lifting from warm water. Lena told him about the stories that everyday objects carried in their hearts, the memories that lived in coffee cups and door handles and the brass buttons on old coats. Morty found himself sharing about his slips between realities, the way overwhelming moments became doorways to gentler possibilities, and how he'd been learning to carry that softness back home. At the corner near the school, they heard raised voices coming from the small park, where some of the older kids gathered before first period. Two boys were locked in the kind of argument that felt like it might spill over into something harder, their words sharp with the fear that hides underneath anger. Other students had begun to gather, drawn by the raw energy of conflict, their own discomfort adding weight to the air. That's when Morty noticed him. A tall, gentle-looking boy standing at the edge of the gathering, not watching the argument like entertainment, but simply being present in a way that seemed to absorb the sharp edges from the air around him. He didn't speak or intervene, just breathed with the kind of steadiness that reminded everyone else how breathing was supposed to work. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the harshness began to drain from the two boys' voices. Their shoulders softened, their angry gestures became less cutting, until their words, though still firm, lost their ability to wound. The boy with the gentle presence offered a small nod of understanding, and the two who had been fighting looked at each other with something closer to confusion than rage, as if they'd forgotten what they were so angry about in the first place. "Marcus," Lena said softly, as the crowd began to disperse, and the morning returned to its peaceful rhythm. "He has a gift for showing people where the soft exits are, the ones that don't require anyone to lose face or admit defeat." Marcus walked over to them, with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that most problems solved themselves if you gave them enough gentle space. "Morning," he said, and his voice carried the same quality Morty had been noticing in all these encounters, like words that had been soaked in understanding before being spoken. "You two found each other." Before Morty could ask how Marcus knew they'd been looking, the answer settled into his awareness like sugar dissolving in warm tea. Of course they'd been looking. Of course they'd found each other. In a town like Crewcoo, where the air itself seemed to breathe with possibility, people who carried similar gifts would naturally gravitate toward one another, like streams finding their way to the same ocean. "There's someone else," Marcus said, his eyes moving toward the bakery at the edge of town, where smoke was already rising from the chimney, like a gentle signal. "Eleanor. She's been waiting for all of us to find our way to each other. She bakes bread that tastes like forgiveness, and she's been feeling the changes in the town's rhythm ever since you started carrying peace back from those other places." The three of them walked together through the morning streets, past the familiar landmarks that suddenly felt like waypoints on a map they were only beginning to understand. At Elena's bakery, the scent of cardamom and yeast mingled with something deeper, something that made the air itself feel like an embrace. Elena stood behind her counter, hands dusted with flour, eyes holding the kind of warmth that made you remember what it felt like to be completely safe. When she saw the three of them enter together, her face bloomed into a smile that felt like coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar territory. "Ah," she said, her voice carrying the slight music of someone who had learned English as a language of the heart. "My gentle crew has found itself. I have been feeling your presence in the town like ripples in still water, each of you learning to carry what the world needs most." She placed warm bread in their hands, and when Morty tasted it, he understood that some hungers could only be satisfied by the knowledge that you belonged somewhere, with people who saw your strangeness as a form of beauty. Standing there in the morning light, surrounded by people who understood that healing wasn't about fixing, but about making space for hearts to breathe, Morty felt something settle in his chest that he had never experienced before. Not the weight of carrying the world's sorrows alone, but the lightness of sharing them with others who knew that the gentlest touch could move mountains, one small kindness at a time. Outside, Crewcoo continued its peaceful morning routine, but inside Elena's bakery something new was beginning. A crew was finding itself, drawn together not by adventure or danger, but by the shared understanding that the world needed more softness, and they had been given the strange and wonderful gift of being able to provide it. The warmth of Elena's bread still lingered in their hands as they stepped back into the morning light, but something had shifted in the quality of their attention. Elena walked beside them toward the town center, her flour-dusted apron catching the salt breeze, her eyes holding the kind of knowing that comes from years of watching hearts learn to heal themselves when given the right conditions. "There is someone," she said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle authority as the tide that knows exactly when to reach the shore. Mrs. Kowalski at the library. She has been carrying a winter that won't let go, and I think today might be the day she remembers that spring is still possible. They found her in the poetry section, moving between the shelves with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb the grief that had settled around her like morning fog. Mrs. Kowalski had always been the kind of librarian who could find exactly the book you needed before you knew you were looking for it, but today she held herself like someone who had lost the ability to be found, her shoulders curved around a sorrow that seemed to bend the very light around her. Morty felt it immediately, the way the air thickened with unshed tears, the way silence took on weight and texture. This wasn't the overwhelming chaos that usually triggered his slips between dimensions, but something deeper, more resonant. His chest fluttered with recognition, as if his heart was learning to tune itself to frequencies of pain that needed gentling. Without speaking, they moved toward her, not like strangers approaching, but like streams naturally converging around a stone worn smooth by too much weather. Mrs. Kowalski looked up from the volume of Neruda she'd been holding without seeing, and her eyes held the particular emptiness that comes after crying stops, working as relief. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been apologizing for existing ever since the world became too sharp to bear. "I keep coming here thinking the words will make sense again, but they just swim around like they're trying to escape." Morty closed his eyes and let his awareness drift, not seeking escape, but searching for a gentler frequency of this same moment. He found it in a dimension where Mrs. Kowalski's grief was still present, but somehow lighter, where sorrow moved through her like water through cupped hands instead of settling in her bones like lead. He breathed in that possibility, that texture, of grief that didn't crush, and when he returned to his own reality, he carried it with him like a warm stone in his pocket. Lena had placed her hand near the book Mrs. Kowalski was holding, her eyes going distant, with the kind of listening that happened when objects decided to share their deepest stories. "This book remembers being read aloud," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the library's hush. Someone's voice, gentle and patient, reading these same poems to someone they loved very much. He would do different voices for the speakers, wouldn't he? Made Neruda sound like he was telling secrets just for you. Mrs. Kowalski's breath caught, and for the first time since they'd approached, something alive flickered behind her eyes. "Harold," she whispered, and the name fell into the space between them like a small prayer. "He said poetry was just love letters that everyone was allowed to read. Sunday mornings he would make coffee and read to me while I pretended to grade papers." Marcus had positioned himself slightly behind her, and Morty could see the way he was absorbing the sharp edges of her pain, not taking it away, but somehow making it less likely to cut. The air around them began to feel breathable again, like a room where windows had finally been opened after being sealed too long. Eleanor appeared with the quiet grace of someone who understood that healing happened in the spaces between intention and action. She carried a small paper bag that smelled of cardamom and something deeper, something that reminded you of being completely safe and utterly understood. "I brought you something," she said, her voice carrying the kind of tenderness that could make strong people weep with relief. The bread was still warm, and when Mrs. Kowalski took a small bite, her eyes closed with something that looked almost like surprise. "It tastes like Sunday mornings," she said, wonder replacing weight in her voice, like Harold humming while he made pancakes, like the sound of pages turning in good light. Eleanor's smile held decades of understanding human hearts and their infinite capacity for both breaking and mending. "Some recipes are not for hunger," she said simply. "They are for remembering that love changes shape but never disappears." They stayed with her until the afternoon light began to slant through the library windows, at the angle that meant evening was thinking about arriving. They didn't talk much, just sat together in the comfortable silence that comes when people stop trying to fix each other and simply agree to be present for whatever needs to be felt. When Mrs. Kowalski finally stood to leave, She moved differently. Not like someone carrying a lighter load, but like someone who had remembered she didn't have to carry it alone. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been invited to sit down, offered tea, and in being welcomed rather than fought, it had put down its sharpest edges. After she left, the four of them sat in the gathering dusk, understanding without words that something important had just happened. They hadn't taken Mrs. Kowalski's grief away, hadn't tried to convince her that everything would be fine. Instead, they had simply made space for her sorrow to exist without shame, had surrounded it with such gentle attention that it remembered how to move instead of staying frozen. "This is what we do," Elena said, her voice soft with satisfaction. "We take nothing but heaviness, leave nothing but the space for hearts to breathe. We help people remember that they are not alone with their tenderness." Outside, Crewcoo settled, came to evening with the satisfied sigh of a town where good work had been done. The first soft heist was complete, and it felt like the beginning of everything that mattered. The evening that followed their time with Mrs. Kowalski settled around them like a gentle blanket, carrying the quiet satisfaction that comes not from solving something, but from witnessing it with such tenderness that it remembers how to breathe. They found themselves drawn back to Elena's bakery, where the lingering warmth of ovens and the soft glow of lamplight created a sanctuary for hearts learning to understand their own strange gifts. Elena moved through her kitchen with the unhurried grace of someone who treated every small ritual as a form of prayer. She poured tea that smelled of chamomile and something deeper, something that tasted like the memory of being completely safe, and arranged slices of bread still warm from the afternoon's baking. When she finally sat at the worn wooden table that had witnessed countless conversations about the art of gentle healing, her eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent decades learning the difference between helping and harming. "What we did today," she began, her voice carrying the soft authority of ocean tides that know exactly when to reach the shore. This was not about taking Mrs. Kowalski's grief away. It was about making space for her sorrow to exist without shame, to move instead of staying frozen. She paused, letting her words settle like seeds in fertile ground. "There is a great difference, my dears, between healing and erasing, between comfort and avoidance." Morty felt something click into place in his chest, like a puzzle piece finding its perfect home. His dimension slipping had always felt like visiting a library of calm, checking out moments of peace and understanding to bring back to his own reality. Now he understood that he wasn't meant to replace his world with those gentler versions, but to learn from them, to borrow their texture of possibility and carry it home like a warm stone in his pocket. Elena turned her attention to each of them with the careful consideration of a gardener tending different varieties of flowers. "Lena, your gift for hearing the stories that objects carry, this is a form of witnessing that the world desperately needs. But you must learn the difference between listening and drowning. Some memories are too heavy for one heart to carry alone." She reached across the table and touched Lena's hand gently. "You are not a repository for every sorrow that was ever stored in wood and metal and glass. You are a translator, helping forgotten love find its voice again." Marcus, who had been sitting with his characteristic stillness, nodded as Elena's gaze settled on him. "And you, dear one, your ability to absorb the sharp edges of anger and fear. This is beautiful and necessary work. But remember, you are not a sponge for the world's pain. You are a teacher showing people where the soft exits are, how to find the quiet center even in the middle of a storm." The bread Elena offered them tasted like morning light, and the patience of yeast learning to transform simple ingredients into something nourishing. As they ate, she continued sharing the wisdom that came from a lifetime of gentle intervention. "Your gifts come with what my grandmother used to call sacred responsibilities. You cannot heal what you do not understand, and you cannot understand what you are not willing to feel." She stood and wrote something on a brown paper bag with careful, deliberate strokes. "Take nothing but heaviness, leave nothing but the space for hearts to breathe." The words seemed to shimmer with their own gentle authority as she placed the bag in the center of the table. "This is our only rule, our true compass. We do not impose our peace. We simply make room for it to be found." Over the days that followed, Eleanor guided them through what she called the apprenticeship of paying attention. They learned to observe the subtle emotional currents that moved through Crewcoo like invisible tides, to sense where a heart felt heavy, where a spirit carried burdens too large for its frame. Morty discovered that his slips between dimensions could be controlled, purposeful, seeking specific textures of understanding rather than general escape. He learned to visit what he began to think of as archives of what almost was, places where all the peace that almost happened in his world was carefully stored, waiting to be borrowed and shared. Lena spent time in the town's antique shops and along the harbor, learning to distinguish between simple memories and stories that truly needed to be heard and gently acknowledged. Marcus found that his presence could create safe spaces, not just for conflict resolution, but for unspoken grief to finally find expression, for hearts to remember how to be tender without fear. Elena taught them practical techniques too, small, rituals for returning to themselves after giving so much attention to others' pain. She pressed a small tin into Morty's hands, containing sugared orange peels and a card that read, "Return to yourself." "You give warmth," she explained, "and some remains on other people's hands. This is not loss, it is circulation. But your own fire deserves tending." They practiced on the smallest possible scale, as Elena put it, proofing the dough of your gifts. A fisherman with a torn net and old disappointments he couldn't name. A boy whose paper kite kept diving into the harbor, his shoulders rising higher with each failure. They learned to ask first, even silently, to move at the pace of trust, to bring back warmth rather than answers. Once Morty moved too quickly, borrowing a calm that didn't belong to a woman at the bus stop yet. The moment felt clean on the surface but hollow underneath, like fruit waxed to shine. That night, he sat with the discomfort he had tried to spare her, letting it teach him about patience. The next day, he offered only his umbrella and the words, "That sounded like it hurt." The rain did what rain does, washing edges without erasing shapes, and she spoke 3 sentences that were enough. As the evening light painted the bakery windows in shades of rose and gold, the 4 of them sat in comfortable silence, understanding that they were no longer just individuals with strange gifts, but a crew learning the sacred art of making space for hearts to breathe. They were gardeners now, Elena reminded them, not surgeons. They made conditions where healing could remember itself, one gentle moment at a time. The days following Elena's gentle lessons settled into Morty's awareness like seeds finding fertile ground. Her words about sacred responsibilities and the difference between healing and erasing had taken root in that quiet space behind his ribs where understanding lived, and he found himself approaching his gift with a new quality of intention. No longer did the overwhelming moments feel like chaos to escape from, but rather like invitations to explore the vast landscape of possibility that existed in the spaces between what was and what could be. It was during one of these purposeful explorations, sitting in the liminal hour when afternoon dissolved into evening, that Morty discovered what he would come to think of as the Library of Almost. He had been practicing Elena's teachings about returning to himself after giving attention to others' pain, letting his awareness drift toward those sideways places where gentleness lived like patient books on infinite shelves. Instead of visiting a single alternate moment, he found himself standing in what felt like a vast reading room where all the peace that had almost happened in his reality was carefully catalogued and waiting. The space breathed with the quiet hum of a library after closing time, when stories whisper to each other across the darkness. It wasn't grand or endless in the way of fairy tales, but precise and lovingly organized, like a kitchen where every spoon knew its drawer. Shelves reached higher than he could touch, but not to the point of intimidation, each one holding what looked like slim volumes and small sealed envelopes labeled in tidy handwriting. Almost said "I'm sorry," almost stayed for dinner, almost asked if you were okay. The labels weren't accusatory, but sounded like lullabies for moments that had been too shy to be born. At the center of this luminous expanse sat a figure with ink-stained fingers and hair the color of early morning, their presence neither imposing nor absent, just quietly available like a good friend who knows when to speak and when to simply be. When they looked up from their work, Their smile asked nothing and gave permission for everything. A small woven basket sat on the counter between them, and when they spoke, their voice was quiet enough to make the lamps lean in. "You may carry 3, they said simply. "Not events. Textures. You know the difference." Morty did know, thanks to Elena's patient teaching. Outcomes belong to the living world, but the feeling of possibility could be borrowed like warmth cupped between hands. He moved through the archive with the careful attention of someone learning to read a new language, one written in the emotional frequencies of almost understanding, almost tenderness, almost home. Here were all the conversations between his parents that had almost bloomed into genuine connection, all the moments when Rick had almost let his gruff affection show, all the instances when Summer had almost revealed the vulnerability that lived beneath her defensive sarcasm. From a shelf that hummed with familiar warmth, he chose a thin volume labeled, "Almost Said I'm Proud of You." It held the same weather as his grandfather's lab when the machine slept, carrying the texture of recognition without demand. Another, whispered from a lower shelf, almost laughed at the same time, and he could picture his parents at the kitchen table, an almost bridge across a tired morning. The third took him by surprise, a narrow box tucked as if shy. Almost put the tools down and rested. He lifted it gently, feeling the quiet inside like a dim room with a chair by the window. The librarian slid a small card toward him, not to stamp a date, but to write a reminder in that same tidy hand, "Return by integration." Their eyes held decades of patient understanding. You don't have to bring them back so much as learn them so well that you no longer need to carry them. When Morty stepped back into his regular reality, the evening had barely shifted, but something fundamental had changed in his understanding. The 3 textures had settled into his chest, not as foreign objects but as reminders of what was always possible, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. He walked home with the easy caution of someone carrying tea across a room, understanding that he now held not solutions, but invitations. The first test came that very evening, when his parents' familiar argument about money and disappointment began to fill the kitchen with its sharp edges. Instead of retreating or slipping into a completely different dimension, Morty closed his eyes and let the borrowed texture of "almost laughed at the same time" rise in him like gentle warmth. He didn't try to interrupt or fix anything, just moved quietly through the space, making tea with the kind of unhurried attention that reminded everyone present that small acts of care were always available. When his father reached for the sugar and their hands bumped, both made the same awkward noise at the same moment. The borrowed lightness helped that almost chuckle become real, lasting only 2 seconds, but changing everything and nothing, softening the angles of the room just enough for his mother to meet his father's eyes with less hurry, for the morning to breathe a little easier. At school the next day, Morty found himself outside Mrs. Henderson's classroom, where she sorted papers with the quiet care of someone putting seashells into careful piles. The texture of "almost said I'm proud of you" hummed gently in his chest, not as something to impose, but as permission for warmth to surface if it wanted to. When he offered to help with the stapling, they worked in companionable silence until she looked over with a softness he'd never seen before. "You've got a steady way about you lately," she said, and the words sat down between them as if they planned to stay. That afternoon, returning to the library of Almost felt like visiting a trusted friend. The librarian welcomed him with the same steady presence, and Morty found himself drawn to an envelope he'd noticed before. "Almost asked if you were okay, Summer." He placed his hand on it gently, feeling the warmth of recognition without urgency. Not yet, he told the moment silently, but soon. The library would wait. He would wait. The Almosts would become arrivals in their own time. Walking back through Crewcoo's gentle streets, Morty saw Lena at the bookstore window, palm pressed to glass, listening to stories only she could hear. Marcus sat on the park bench where conflicts usually flared, his presence a calm lighthouse that people approached without realizing they were seeking harbor. The crew didn't need many words to understand that something had shifted, that their gentle work now had access to an infinite archive of possibility. That evening, as salt air drifted through his bedroom window, and the ocean turned pages somewhere in the dark, Morty understood that he had found not an escape from his reality, but a way to tend it more carefully. The Library of Almost wasn't about finding a perfect world to live in, but about learning to see the perfect moments already embedded in his imperfect life, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. Every harsh word contained the seed of a gentler one. Every closed door remembered how to open, and every family carried within it the capacity for the tenderness they had never really lost, only temporarily forgotten how to speak. Tomorrow he would share this discovery with his crew, would learn how this archive of almost peace might serve their gentle work in making space for hearts to breathe. Tonight, he would practice the art of carrying borrowed possibilities back to the one reality he called home, one patient breath at a time, understanding that the greatest adventures happened not in escaping the world, but in helping it remember its own infinite capacity for grace. The morning after, Morty's discovery of the Library of Almost arrived, with the kind of coastal light that made everything in Crewcoo look like it had been gently polished by salt air and infinite possibility. He woke with the borrowed textures still warm in his chest, particularly the envelope labeled, "Almost asked if you were okay, Summer," which hummed with patient anticipation like a letter, waiting for exactly the right moment to be opened. That moment announced itself with the familiar sound of Summer's voice cutting through the morning quiet, sharp with the kind of defensive humor that had become her signature way of moving through the world. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold while she scrolled through her phone, her shoulders carrying the particular tension of someone who was always ready for the next thing to go wrong, always prepared to have the perfect comeback ready before anyone could find a soft spot to aim for. "So this is the famous town that turned you into some kind of Zen master," she said when Morty appeared, trying for teasing but landing somewhere closer to curious. Her eyes held that familiar mixture of affection and wariness that had defined their relationship for as long as either could remember, the look of someone who loved deeply but had learned to keep her armor polished just in case. Morty moved through the morning routine with the gentle attention Eleanor had taught him, making fresh coffee and placing it near Summer's elbow without fanfare or expectation. The borrowed texture of almost concern hummed softly in his chest, not as something to impose, but as permission for genuine care to surface naturally, like morning light finding its way through curtains that had been drawn too tightly for too long. "You're different," Summer observed, and her voice carried genuine curiosity instead of its usual edge of suspicion. "Less jumpy. Like you figured out some secret the rest of us are still trying to crack." She looked at him with the kind of attention that suggested she was seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years, not as her annoying little brother, but as someone who might actually understand something important about the weight they both carried. Instead of deflecting or making a joke, Morty let the Library of Almost offer him something new. Her texture labeled almost told the truth about feeling scared. He felt it rise in him like gentle warmth, creating space for honesty that didn't require performance or defense. "I've been learning about making space," he said simply, "for the parts of us that don't have to be perfect all the time." Summer's phone screen went dark, forgotten. The words sat between them like a small bridge neither had expected to find, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, the kitchen felt like a place where truth might be welcome. They ended up walking toward the pier together, letting the conversation unfold like morning mist, lifting from warm water, each step carrying them away from their familiar roles and toward something neither quite knew how to name. The pier stretched into the harbor like a wooden prayer, weathered by countless tides and patient as the ocean itself. They sat on the sun-warmed planks, and Summer began to speak in the way people do when they've finally found someone who might understand the exhaustion of always being strong, always having the perfect comeback ready, always being the one who has everything figured out. "I keep thinking I should be happier," she said, her voice barely audible above the gentle rhythm of water against the pier. "Like I have everything I thought I wanted. But it all feels like I'm performing in a play where I forgot to learn my lines." She picked up a piece of sea glass, worn smooth by countless tides, turning it over in her palm like a question she didn't know how to ask. Morty felt the texture of "almost asked if you were okay" bloom in his chest, but instead of forcing the question, he let it create space for whatever Summer needed to feel. The borrowed understanding from infinite almosts reminded him that sometimes the most profound conversations happened not when you asked the right questions, but when you made room for the right silences. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I just stopped pretending I know what I'm doing, Summer continued, and her words carried the kind of vulnerability that usually hid behind sharp wit and perfectly timed sarcasm. Like, what if I'm not actually the smart one or the funny one or the one who has it all together? What if I'm just as lost as everyone else, but I've gotten really good at making it look like confidence? The sun climbed higher, painting the water in shades of gold and possibility. They talked about their parents, about Rick, about the strange weight of growing up in a family where brilliance and dysfunction lived side by side, like uncomfortable roommates who had never learned each other's names. For the first time, Summer spoke about the loneliness of always being expected to be strong, and Morty shared the exhaustion of always feeling like he was carrying too much of the world's sadness in his chest. That's when Lena appeared, not intruding, but arriving like a page turning itself at exactly the right moment. She had been walking along the harbor, listening to the stories that Driftwood wanted to tell, when she heard the particular quality of their conversation, the sound of hearts learning to be honest with each other. She approached with the careful grace of someone who understood that healing happened in the spaces between intention and action. "Your jacket pocket told me it gets heavy," Lena said softly, pressing a small smooth pebble into Summer's palm. Her eyes flicked to the denim like it was an old friend carrying too many secrets. "This is for when you want to put something down without losing it." Summer turned the pebble over, expecting writing or some kind of explanation, but finding only the simple weight of something that had been polished by time and tide into perfect smoothness. "Is everything in this town poetic?" she asked, but the question had no armor on it, just the genuine wonder of someone discovering that gentleness could be a language worth learning. Marcus appeared a little later, drawn by the same gentle current that seemed to guide people toward exactly where they needed to be in Crewcoo. He leaned against the pier's railing, his calm spreading in the unobtrusive way of shadows at sundown, and the words around them seemed to soften, their edges rounded by his presence, until even difficult truths felt safe to speak aloud. Elena arrived last, carrying a paper bag that breathed with warmth and the scent of cardamom mixed with something deeper, something that reminded you of being completely safe and utterly understood. "Cardamom and rest," she said, placing a slice of bread in Summer's hand. "Eat slowly. This bread knows how to turn down the volume." Summer chewed thoughtfully, and her face did that complicated expression people make when surprise and relief try to bow at the same time. "It tastes like—" "Being allowed to go first in line," she said, then shook her head at herself. "That sounded dumb." "It sounded true," Elena answered, and left it at that, understanding that sometimes the most profound healing happened when people were allowed to name their experience without judgment or correction. They stayed until the horizon gathered its blues, and the pier's boards cooled with the approaching evening. Morty let the second texture he'd borrowed, almost put the tools down and rested, rise gently. Not to push, but to mirror back what was already in Summer's eyes. The exhaustion of always being ready for battle, even when peace was being offered freely. "You don't have to be funny here," he said quietly, "or strong or quick. You can just be tired if that's what's true." Summer was quiet for a long time, watching the ocean write something in foam and salt that no one needed to read. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted finally. "If I'm not managing everything, I feel like I'll be uninvited from my own life." "Then don't stop," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that the gentlest healing often came through acceptance rather than change. "Just pause between steps. Let the music catch up with you." Lena's fingers brushed the frayed cuff of Summer's sleeve, and her eyes went distant, with the kind of listening that happened when fabric decided to share its memories. "This thread remembers a day by the lake," she said half to herself. "Sunburn and cheap lemonade. You let your hair get tangled and didn't care. You allowed and it was okay." Summer's mouth trembled and then steadied, and something in her chest that had been holding its breath for years finally remembered how to exhale. "I remember," she whispered, and the memory settled on her shoulder like a tired cat finally finding a warm place to rest. As the evening light painted everything in shades of rose and gold, they walked back through town in a quiet cluster. Not a parade or a rescue mission, just people moving at the speed of trust. Eleanor opened the bakery's upstairs room, where a quilt smelling faintly of oranges waited like a patient friend who had been expecting exactly this guest at exactly this time. Summer lay down like someone negotiating a careful treaty with gravity, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of softness that only emerged when people finally felt safe enough to put down their weapons. "Don't make it weird," she said, but the words were already smiling as they left her, and within minutes her breath found that even rhythm children know and adults forget, the room brightening and dimming with the tide of sleep. Morty went to the front steps and watched the town settle into evening, understanding that he had witnessed something profound in its very ordinariness. The Library of Almost had offered its textures not as solutions, but as invitations, creating space for Summer to remember that strength could include the courage to be soft, that having everything figured out was less important than being willing to figure it out together. Down the road, a car he didn't recognize rolled by slowly, windows cracked, two weary faces scanning for something they couldn't yet name, but that was tomorrow's gentle work. Tonight, Summer dreamed of a lake where being loud was perfectly acceptable, and Morty rested his hands on the cool step, letting the evening fold around him like a blanket woven from understanding, the crew's quiet presence stitched into the town's breathing. The next small kindness, already arranging itself just beyond the edge of words, the morning after Summer, found rest in Elena's upstairs room arrived, with the kind of coastal light that made everything in Crewcoo look like it had been painted with watercolors left out in gentle rain. Morty woke to the sound of his sister moving quietly in the kitchen below, her footsteps carrying a different rhythm than usual, less hurried, more present. The borrowed texture of almost put the tools down and rested had settled into her bones like sunlight absorbed through skin, and when she appeared at Elena's bakery with coffee and a small, genuine smile, it felt like witnessing the first green shoot after a long winter. The crew gathered naturally in the morning light, understanding without words that something had shifted in their work the night before. Summer's willingness to be vulnerable had taught them something about the sacred nature of witness, about the difference between fixing and simply holding space for hearts to breathe. Elena poured tea that smelled of chamomile and something deeper, something that reminded you of being completely safe, and they sat in comfortable silence, letting the town's gentle rhythm prepare them for whatever small acts of tenderness the day might call upon them to perform. That's when the car from the previous evening returned, moving through Crewcoo's streets with the careful hesitation of people who weren't sure they belonged anywhere anymore. It was a dark sedan, travel-worn and carrying the weight of too many miles driven without destination, and when it finally stopped near the small town square, the family that emerged moved like they were underwater, each step requiring conscious effort, each breath a negotiation with gravity that had become too heavy. The parents held themselves with the particular stillness of people who had learned that any sudden movement might shatter what little composure they had left. Between them, two young children clung with the desperate grip of those who had already lost too much to trust that anything would stay. Their silence wasn't peaceful but sharp, cutting through Crewcoo's gentle atmosphere like broken glass through silk. Even from across the square, Morty could feel the weight of their sorrow bending the light around them, making the familiar sounds of morning seem almost intrusive. Elena appeared beside him, with the quiet grace of tide reaching shore, her eyes already soft with the kind of recognition that came from decades of witnessing hearts, in various stages of breaking and mending. "This grief," she said softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to read the weather of human hearts. "It is not a weight that can be simply lightened. It is a sorrow that needs to be witnessed, held, and honored for what it truly is." Morty felt the familiar tingling begin in his chest, that warm honey sensation that usually preceded his slips between dimensions, but this time it felt different, almost painful, as if the sheer magnitude of their loss was resisting his gentle touch. He wanted to find a dimension where their pain was lighter, where their faces weren't so deeply carved by grief. But Elena's hand on his shoulder reminded him of her teaching. Healing is not erasing, dear one. Sometimes the greatest heist is stealing back someone's right to be seen in their sorrow without judgment. They approached as a crew, but differently than they had with Mrs. Kowalski or any of their previous gentle interventions. This time they moved like people approaching sacred ground, understanding that they were not there to heal but to witness, not to lighten but to hold steady in the presence of something too vast for any single heart to carry alone. The mother looked up as they drew near, her arms wrapped around a small worn sweater that seemed to hold more weight than fabric should be able to bear. Her eyes carried the particular emptiness that comes after crying stops, working as relief, after the well of tears runs dry, but the source of sorrow remains as full as ever. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words automatic as breathing. "We're not from here. We couldn't stay in the house anymore." Everything there remembers her. Lily was 6, the father added, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been explaining this loss over and over, to doctors and relatives and well-meaning friends who wanted to help but didn't understand that some griefs couldn't be helped, only held, 3 weeks ago. "We keep thinking we'll wake up, but we don't." Lena had moved closer, her gift for hearing the stories that objects carried, allowing her to listen without intruding. The small sweater in the mother's arms whispered of grass stains and laughter, of a song about clouds that shaped themselves into animals and dream countries. "She loved to make up verses," Lena said softly, her voice barely disturbing the morning air. "Something about clouds that danced instead of just floating by." The mother's breath caught, and for the first time since they'd arrived, something alive flickered behind her eyes. "She said the clouds were having tea parties in the sky," she whispered, and the words fell into the space between them like small prayers. "Made us pull over once to watch them pour invisible sugar into invisible cups." Marcus had positioned himself nearby, not trying to absorb their pain as he usually did, but simply becoming a steady presence that didn't flinch or turn away from the magnitude of their loss. His calm wasn't meant to replace their grief, but to create a safe harbor where it could exist without shame, where the full weight of their love for Lily could be felt without the pressure to make it smaller for other people's comfort. Elena appeared with her quiet grace, carrying not bread this time, but a simple thermos of tea and small ceramic cups that looked like they had held countless sorrows and survived them all. "Chamomile and thyme," she said simply, pouring the golden liquid with hands that had learned to be steady in the presence of the unsteady. "This is not for fixing. This is for lasting through the next hour." They sat together on the weathered bench near the square as the morning stretched toward noon, creating a circle of presence around the family's grief, letting it exist without trying to diminish it or rush it toward resolution. The children gradually moved closer to the crew, drawn perhaps by the quality of people who understood that the world could feel too big and too sharp, that sometimes the only safety was in the presence of those who didn't need you to be okay. Morty closed his eyes and let his awareness drift, not seeking escape, but searching for some texture of understanding that might create space for this magnitude of loss. In the library of almost, he found not lighter versions of their grief, but dimensions where such profound sorrow was given the reverence it deserved, where love this deep was honored even in its absence. He breathed in that quality of sacred witness and brought it back, letting it settle around them like invisible incense. "I keep forgetting she's gone," the father said eventually, his words falling into the gentle space they had created. "I'll see something funny and turn to tell her, or I'll buy the cereal she liked, or I'll hear that cloud song on the radio and reach to turn it up before I remember." "That's love," Elena said simply, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of hearts learning to carry the weight of absence. "Love doesn't stop when breathing stops. It just changes shape, learns to live in different places. The forgetting isn't failure. It's proof that she was so much a part of your daily life that your heart needs time to learn the new geography." The ocean continued its patient rhythm beyond the harbor, writing messages in foam that no one needed to read, and slowly, gradually, the family's grief began to settle into a different shape. Not smaller, not lighter, but somehow more breathable, held in the presence of people who understood that some sorrows were too sacred to be solved, too profound to be healed, and could only be witnessed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for cathedrals or mountaintops. As the afternoon light began to slant across the water in shades of rose and gold, the crew realized they were learning something new about their gifts, something Elena had perhaps been waiting for them to discover on their own. Sometimes the greatest act of healing was simply refusing to turn away, creating space where the full magnitude of love and loss could exist without the pressure to transform into something more manageable. The family would stay in Crewcoo for several days, and each day the crew would find them, not with solutions or comfort, but with the steady presence that said, "Your grief is welcome here. Your love for her is honored here. Your right to carry this weight at your own pace is protected here." And in that witnessing, something began to shift. Not in the grief itself, but in the family's ability to carry it without feeling like they were carrying it alone. That evening, as Saltaire drifted through Elena's bakery, and the ocean turned pages somewhere in the dark, Morty understood that their gentle work had deepened into something more sacred than he had ever imagined. They were not healers in the traditional sense, but guardians of the space where hearts could be fully human, where love could be honored in all its forms, even when it wore the heavy coat of sorrow. The infinite heist had revealed its truest nature, not taking away the world's pain, but stealing back its right to be felt, witnessed and held with tender reverence, one patient breath at a time. The fourth day of the grieving family's stay in Crewcoo arrived with the kind of morning light that made everything look like it had been painted with watercolors left out in gentle rain. But the peace was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong to sea or wind. The familiar wheeze of an interdimensional portal cut through the harbor's quiet rhythm, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone cursing at technology that probably violated several laws of physics. Rick Sanchez emerged from the swirling green vortex looking us, exactly like someone who had traveled across multiple dimensions specifically, to drag his grandson back to a life of chaotic adventures. His lab coat was stained with substances that glowed faintly in the morning light. His hair defied gravity with characteristic stubbornness, and his eyes held that familiar mixture of brilliance and impatience that had defined so much of Morty's life. "Morty." Rick's voice cut through Crewcoo's gentle atmosphere like a buzzsaw through silk. "What the hell are you doing in this cosmic dead zone? I've been tracking your dimensional signature for weeks, and it keeps leading me to this place where absolutely nothing interesting is happening." He gestured dismissively at the peaceful streets, the harbor where boats bobbed like patient prayers. "Seriously, this place has all the excitement of watching paint dry in slow motion." Morty felt the familiar tightness begin in his chest, but instead of the overwhelming pull toward another dimension, he found himself anchored by Elena's teaching about meeting moments exactly as they were. "Hey, Rick," he said, and his voice carried a steadiness that made his grandfather pause mid-gesture. "I've been learning some things here, about making space for people to breathe." Rick's response died in his throat as he took in the scene more carefully, his scientific mind cataloging details that didn't fit his expectations. The way Morty stood without fidgeting, the gentle attention of people gathered nearby, the quality of light that seemed somehow more forgiving than physics should allow. "What kind of weird mind control thing is happening here?" Rick demanded, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You're moving different, talking different. Did someone drug the water supply with cosmic chill pills?" Eleanor appeared with her characteristic grace, carrying coffee that smelled like it had been brewed with patience instead of just beans. She offered it to Rick without ceremony, her eyes holding the kind of warmth that made you remember what safety felt like. Rick took the cup with suspicious caution, but when he tasted it, his expression shifted to something approaching wonder. "This is just coffee," he said, confusion replacing dismissal. "How is it just coffee, but also, what did you do to it?" "Nothing," Eleanor said simply. "Sometimes the most profound changes happen when we stop trying to change things and simply pay attention to what's already there." Rick's gaze followed. Elena's gesture toward the bench where the grieving family sat with their morning tea, their children playing quietly nearby. For the first time in longer than Morty could remember, his grandfather became completely still, not restless stillness, but the deep quiet of someone encountering something that required all his attention to understand. "Dimensional trauma," Rick muttered, his scientific instincts kicking in. "Loss-based reality displacement. I could build something to help with the psychological integration, maybe a memory modifier that would—" "Rick." Morty's voice was gentle but firm. "They don't need to be fixed. They need to be seen." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Marcus had moved closer with his characteristic grace, and Rick found himself experiencing something he'd almost forgotten, being in someone's presence without needing to perform his intelligence or defend his cynicism. Lena approached with a small, worn toy from the family's belongings, a wind-up bird whose cheerful chirp seemed too bright for this kind of morning. "This wants to sing differently," she said softly. Something gentler. Rick picked up the toy, thumb brushing its penny-scratched paint. Without drama, he took a small screwdriver from his pocket and made the tiniest adjustment to its mechanism. When he wound it again, the song came out lower, a soft trill that knew how to sit beside grief without trying to drown it. The mother looked up from her bench. "Thank you," she whispered, as if the bird had needed permission to be quiet too. Rick shrugged, eyes darting away the way people do when kindness threatens to become a mirror. They stood in the square as afternoon light slanted toward evening, creating an informal constellation that could only be understood from the inside. Rick's portal gun sat unused against a lamppost, and for the first time in years, he looked genuinely tired. Not the manic exhaustion of constant motion, but the deeper weariness of someone who had been running so long he'd forgotten what he was running from. "You've been borrowing what exactly?" Rick asked finally, skeptical out of habit but curious against his will. "Textures," Morty answered. "From places where the almost are saved. Not to replace what is, but to remember what's possible." Rick rubbed his thumb over the small screwdriver he'd used on the bird, then put it back in his pocket, not as a burden but as a reminder that some small adjustments could make the world a little softer without breaking anything important. He sat then, really sat in a way Morty had rarely seen. The portal gun looked abandoned and survived it. Helena hummed something under her breath that the evening breeze recognized. The ocean continued its patient conversation with the shore. When Rick finally stood to leave, he looked at Morty with something that might have been recognition. "You're doing a thing," he said, the words clearly having fought their way through several defenses to arrive. Rick handed him a small device, no bigger than a coin, warm from his palm. "Pay me when your meditation retreat turns into actual adventure," he said. But there was no pressure in it, only the strange softness of permission. The portal opened quietly, as if even it had learned to mind its manners in Crewcoo. Rick stepped through, then glanced back as if the town had something he needed to memorize for later. "Keep the frequency low," he added, and Morty understood he didn't mean the device. After he was gone, the square felt the same and different, like a room after a deep conversation that leaves everything exactly where it was, but teaches you new ways to see. The wind-up bird kept its gentler song, and somewhere in the growing dusk, Morty felt the quiet satisfaction of witnessing someone remember, even briefly, what it felt like to put down their tools and simply rest in the presence of people who didn't need them, to be anything other than tired, and human, and worthy of a moment's peace. The evening after Rick's quiet departure settled around Crewcoo like a gentle blanket, carrying the strange satisfaction that comes from witnessing someone remember, however briefly, what it felt like to put down their tools and simply rest. The wind-up bird sat on Elena's counter, its newly softened song a small testament to the unexpected ways even the most restless hearts could learn to recognize tenderness when they encountered it. The next morning brought a late bus that wheezed to a stop near the harbor, releasing passengers into Crewcoo's salt-touched air. Among them was a small girl with dark hair and eyes that held the particular weight of someone who had learned too early that the world could feel overwhelming in ways adults didn't always understand. She walked beside her grandmother with careful steps, her small hand clutched tightly in the older woman's, her gaze moving constantly as if cataloguing exits and shadows with the unconscious precision of someone whose nervous system had learned to treat rest as a luxury too dangerous to afford. Morty recognized something familiar in her careful movements, the way she checked corners and counted distances with the hypervigilance of someone whose mind had become a wheel that wouldn't stop spinning. It was the same anxious intensity that had once taught him to slip between worlds, back before he'd learned that peace wasn't something to escape toward, but something to cultivate right where you stood. At Elena's bakery, the grandmother settled into a chair with the grateful sigh of someone who had been carrying worry for too long. "This is Lily," she said softly, her voice holding months of sleepless nights. "She hasn't slept properly since we moved. Every time she closes her eyes, her mind starts racing with all the things that might go wrong, all the sounds that might mean danger. She's so tired. But being tired makes everything scarier, and being scared makes it harder to sleep." Lily sat on the edge of her chair like someone ready to run, her backpack still strapped to her shoulders like armor she didn't dare remove. "The shadows keep changing shapes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the bakery's gentle hum. "I keep thinking if I stay awake, I can keep everything safe. But I'm too tired to watch properly anymore." Elena knelt beside Lily's chair with the patient grace of someone who had spent decades learning to move at the speed of trust. "Would you like to hear about the stories that live in everyday things?" she asked softly. "Sometimes when our minds are too busy to rest, we can borrow the patience that lives in objects that have learned to be still." Lena moved closer, placing her hand near an old wooden spoon that rested on the counter. Her eyes went distant with the kind of listening that happened when objects decided to share their deepest memories. "This spoon remembers Sunday mornings," she said, her voice carrying the rhythm of lullabies. Pancake batter and someone humming while they stirred. The sound of rain on windows and no hurry anywhere in the world. Lily's breathing began to slow, her shoulders releasing tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Marcus had positioned himself near the bakery's old rocking chair, his presence creating a calm that spread like ripples on still water. "The chair remembers being rocked," he said quietly. "It knows how to help bodies remember that movement can be soothing instead of alarming." Morty felt the familiar tingling begin in his chest. But instead of seeking escape, he let his awareness drift toward the library of almost, finding shelves devoted to peaceful endings to difficult days. He borrowed the texture of almost felt safe enough to dream, letting it rise in him like gentle warmth, carrying with it the quality of evening light through curtains and the weight of blankets that knew how to hold without confining. "I learned something about the space between sleeping and waking," Morty said softly. "It's not about forcing sleep to come, but about making friends with the quiet time. Sometimes the most peaceful rest happens when we stop trying to sleep and just practice being still with whatever we're feeling." Over the afternoon, they taught Lily what Eleanor called the art of gentle attention. Lena guided her to a collection of sea glass, each piece worn smooth by countless tides. "These were once sharp and broken," Lena explained, "but the ocean held them gently, tumbling them until their edges were gone. Your worries are like these sharp pieces. If you let the quiet ocean in your heart hold them, they can become smooth and beautiful too." Elena brought warm milk with honey and something that smelled like lavender mixed with the memory of being completely safe. "This is for lasting through the quiet hours," she said. "Not for making you sleep, but for reminding your body that rest is always available, even when sleep feels far away." They didn't promise Lily easy sleep or the elimination of her fears. Instead, they showed her how to listen to the stories that familiar objects wanted to tell, how to find lullabies hidden in the sound of wind through leaves, how to make peace with the shadows by giving them gentler names. As evening approached, Lily moved with less urgency, spoke with less fear. When her grandmother prepared to take her back to their room, Lily pressed a small, smooth stone into Morty's palm. "This is for when the wheel won't stop spinning," she said softly. "It remembers being still even when the ocean was wild." That night, Lily didn't fall asleep immediately, but she rested with a quality of stillness that felt different from rigid alertness. She lay quietly, listening to the stories that the quilt wanted to tell, breathing with the rhythm of a town that had learned to move at the speed of trust. When sleep finally came, it arrived not as conquest, but as gentle invitation, like tide reaching shore at exactly the right moment. The crew understood they had witnessed something profound in its very ordinariness. They had taught not the elimination of worry, but the art of carrying it more gently, showing that sometimes the greatest gift wasn't the promise of easy rest, but the tools for making peace with wakefulness, one patient breath at a time. The stone in Morty's pocket felt warm with the memory of small hands that had learned to trust in the possibility of peace, and somewhere in the growing light, the infinite Heist revealed another of its gentle secrets, that healing often meant not taking away what hurt, but teaching it to hurt less sharply, to move through the heart like water instead of settling like stones. The stone Lily had pressed into Morty's palm carried its warmth through the following days, a small anchor that reminded him of the profound truth they had discovered together, that healing wasn't about erasing what hurt, but about teaching it to hurt less sharply, to move through the heart like water instead of settling like stones. As the summer deepened into its most golden weeks, he found himself drawn more frequently to the library of almost, not seeking escape, but exploring with the careful attention of someone learning to read a new language, written in the emotional frequencies of what could be. It was during one of these purposeful explorations, sitting in the liminal hour when afternoon dissolved into evening, that Morty discovered something that made his heart flutter with recognition and longing. Among the infinite shelves of almost moments, he found an entire section that hummed with a different quality than the others. The volumes here didn't whisper of moments that had almost happened, but sang with the deep contentment of a reality where all the departures had become arrivals, where all the goodbyes had transformed into longer hellos. The section was labeled in that same tidy handwriting, "The dimension where everyone stayed." The librarian with ink-stained fingers looked up from their work, their smile holding decades of patient understanding. "This one calls to many travelers," they said softly. "It is beautiful to visit. Few choose to remain." Morty opened the first volume with hands that trembled slightly, and found himself not reading but experiencing a Crewcoo, where the air itself felt subtly different, cleaner, as if all the unspoken anxieties and unresolved tensions had been carefully filtered out. The boats in the harbor bobbed with an even greater serenity, their ropes humming melodies of contentment. Every face he saw held a soft contentment, a quiet joy that didn't need to announce itself. He saw his parents first, not negotiating the small compromises that kept families moving forward, but sitting on a porch swing he didn't remember existing, drinking iced tea with hands that rested easily near each other. Their conversation was a low, murmuring stream that spoke of years of shared understanding, their eyes holding the kind of mutual affection that had always been an almost in his own reality. His father pointed out a distant ship. His mother nodded with a soft smile, and the moment held the quality of a photograph that had never needed to be taken because it would never end. Further down the street, Summer sat by the lighthouse, not scrolling with restless energy, but sketching in a small notebook, her brow unfurrowed, her posture carrying the ease of someone who had never needed to armor herself with sharp wit. Her hair was pulled back with a simple ribbon, and when a passing dog nudged her hand, her laughter was light and free, unburdened by the exhaustion of always being strong. She looked like someone who had been allowed to simply be, without performance or defense, and then he found Rick, not in a garage filled with dangerous experiments, but in a small weathered shack by the water's edge, polishing telescope lenses with the patient attention of someone who had learned that some mysteries were meant to be felt rather than solved. The air around him smelled of salt and old wood instead of ozone and alien chemicals. His shoulders carried less weight, his face held a profound, quiet contemplation, and when he looked up at Morty's approach, his smile was uncomplicated, free of the brilliant cynicism that usually served as both weapon and shield. "Hey, kid," Rick said, no theatrics or bravado, just a greeting that landed without demanding a response. "Want to see what Saturn looks like when you're not in a hurry?" This was it, Morty realized, his heart swelling with profound longing. The dimension where all the potential for peace, all the unspoken tenderness had fully actualized. Here Lena wrote stories instead of just listening to them, her words flowing onto pages with effortless grace. Marcus taught children how to build sandcastles that could withstand the tide, his calm presence a lesson in itself. Eleanor baked bread that tasted not of forgiveness, but of pure, unadulterated joy, because forgiveness had never been necessary. He spent what felt like hours observing this gentle paradise, a loving witness to a life he had always yearned for. The town breathed with perfect rhythm. Conversations bloomed without effort, and every interaction carried the quality of music played by musicians who had been practicing together for lifetimes. And yet, as the initial wave of longing began to recede, a subtle unease began to stir within him. This paradise, while undeniably beautiful, felt somehow static. The perfection was almost too perfect. There were no small sorrows to mend, no sharp edges to gently soften, no conflicts to navigate with careful presence. The challenges that had spurred his own growth, that had called forth the unique gifts of his crew, were simply absent. The almosts were all actualized, but in doing so, the potential for new almost, for the dynamic, messy, beautiful process of growth and discovery, had also vanished. It was like wearing clothes tailored for someone else's perfect life. Beautiful, but they didn't move with him. The love here was a finished product, polished and complete, but in his own reality. Love was a living, breathing thing, always growing, always learning, always making space for whatever needed to be held. Elena appeared beside him with her characteristic grace, carrying a small paper bag and the unfussy mercy of someone who never confused quiet with absence. Of course she existed here too, but this Elena's eyes held satisfaction rather than the gentle authority that came from decades of witnessing hearts in various stages of breaking and mending. "I wondered when you would visit this fold," she said, her voice carrying the friendly seriousness of tide reading the moon. "It has been calling your longing by name." He accepted the bag because you do not refuse an Elena in any dimension. Inside was bread speckled with seeds that looked like punctuation marks, and when he tasted it, he understood the message. Not a period, not an exclamation, but a comma placed exactly where breath belongs. "It tastes like permission to let things be enough," he said, surprised at the steadiness in his own voice. Elena's smile held both pride and recognition. "Paradise is not a place you find, dear one," she said, echoing what his own learning was beginning to whisper. "It is a practice. Here they practice with great devotion. In your crease you practice with great courage. Both are holy work, but only one fits the shape of your particular calling." They walked to the water's edge where the waves wore the same jewelry of light they always wore, no matter the dimension. Morty watched a child teach a dog to wait for the stick, the dog learning patience without heartbreak, the stick flying again in an endless loop of simple joy. He could have stayed. The dimension would have kept him like a well-placed book on a familiar shelf, but he reached into his pocket and held Lily's stone, feeling its weight and warmth, remembering the profound beauty of a child, learning to rest beside her fears rather than having them erased. He thought of summer on Eleanor's quilt, discovering that strength could include the courage to be soft. He thought of his parents' almost laughter becoming real laughter, of Rick's wind-up bird learning to sing more gently beside grief. "I don't think this is my shirt," he said at last, half to Elena, half to the tide. "It's lovely. It just doesn't move with me the way my own life does." Elena nodded as if he had solved a riddle by remembering he didn't have to. "Then take a thread," she said, gesturing to the town with an open palm. "Nothing large. A color you can weave into what you are already making." He closed his eyes and asked the dimension what thread it was willing to offer. What arrived wasn't a moment or a scene, but a texture, the way contentment felt when it wasn't performed, the way peace settled when it didn't need to be defended, the way love moved through a space when it had learned to trust its own welcome. He held that gently, thanked the place that had offered it without bargaining, and felt the familiar tilt begin again, the sideways slide toward his own pier, his own beautiful complications, his own perfectly imperfect crew. When he stepped back into his Crewcoo, the evening was taking its slow pink breath. The bakery windows were plain glass again, but the light through them carried a familiarity he could swear he hadn't quite noticed before. His parents' voices drifted from their kitchen, tired but not harsh, negotiating the small compromises that kept families moving forward, and he heard in their rhythm something new, a patience that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, waiting for the right quality of attention to help it bloom. Summer appeared on the street corner, no longer carrying the restless energy of someone always ready for battle, but moving with the easy grace of someone who had learned she could put down her weapons without becoming defenseless. "The clouds are pouring invisible sugar into invisible cups," she called, pointing to the sky, and he smiled because Lily's language had found new mouths, because poetry was becoming the town's second language. He walked toward Eleanor's bakery, where the crew would naturally gather, understanding that he had witnessed something profound in its very ordinariness. The Library of Almost had offered not escape but perspective, showing him that paradise wasn't somewhere else but right here, in the patient work of making space for everything to be exactly as broken and beautiful as it needed to be. The borrowed thread settled into his chest like a warm stone, ready to be woven into moments when his father would put down his tools before exhaustion, when his mother would laugh without needing a reason, when Rick would remember that some inventions were meant to create comfort instead of chaos. Paradise, he understood now, wasn't a destination, but an angle of approach, a way of rounding the sharp corners of a day, until the pieces sat kindly side by side. The stone from Lily still carried its warmth in his pocket, and somewhere across infinite realities, gentle souls continued the work of making space for hearts to breathe. Tonight, he would share this new understanding with his crew, this wisdom born from the quiet recognition that the greatest adventures happened not in escaping the world, but in learning to love it exactly as it was, one patient breath at a time, trusting that healing happened not through force, but through the steady application of attention, tenderness, and the radical act of refusing to turn away. The infinite Heist had revealed another of its gentle secrets, that the most precious things weren't stolen from other realities, but discovered in the reality you already inhabited, waiting like seeds in fertile ground for the right conditions to bloom. The thread borrowed from the dimension, where everyone stayed, wove itself into Morty's daily awareness like morning light finding its way through curtains, subtle but transformative. His father began putting down tools 5 minutes earlier, asking with awkward sincerity if anyone wanted tea. His mother laughed at small things without apologizing. Summer drew clouds pouring invisible sugar and taped them to the fridge without explanation. For a while, these gentle changes felt like enough, like proof that the infinite Heist was working exactly as it should. But threads, even gentle ones, can tighten when pulled too hard. Over the following weeks, Morty found himself visiting the library of almost more frequently, returning with textures of patience and understanding until his pockets felt crowded with borrowed warmth. He meant well, wanted to be prepared, to meet each heavy heart with exactly the right quality of light. Yet the more he carried, the more hollow he began to feel. Like a vessel designed only for pouring, never for being filled. The weight manifested first as a restless dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with Crewcoo or his crew or the meaningful work they shared. It was more intimate than that. The accumulated exhaustion of someone who had become so skilled at borrowing calm for others that he had forgotten how to generate it for himself. Every texture he brought back, every moment of peace he facilitated, seemed to leave him feeling slightly more empty, as if he were operating from a ledger that only recorded what he gave, never what he received, Elena noticed first, her eyes carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades learning to read the weather of human hearts. It was during one of their evening gatherings, as autumn light painted the bakery windows in shades of gold and possibility, that she set down her tea and studied Morty with careful attention. "You have been giving warmth," she said softly, "and some remains on other people's hands. This is not loss. It is circulation, but your own fire deserves tending." The words landed with the weight of recognition, and suddenly Morty understood what had been building in his chest for weeks. He had become so focused on creating space for others' hearts to breathe that he had never learned to create that same space for himself. The borrowed textures from infinite almost moments had taught him to offer peace to everyone, except the person who needed it most. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from holding the world's sorrows without remembering to share the load. "Every time I see someone hurting, I want to help. But I think I've been trying to fix myself through fixing everyone else, and it's not working." Lena moved closer, her gift for hearing object stories, allowing her to listen to the tale his worn backpack wanted to tell. "This has been holding too much," she said softly, fingers brushing the frayed straps. "It remembers being packed for day trips, but you've been asking it to carry the weight of infinite journeys." Marcus positioned himself nearby, and for the first time, instead of absorbing someone else's sharp edges, he simply sat with the full weight of Morty's exhaustion, creating a safe harbor where it could exist without shame. "I've been practicing generosity," he said quietly, "but not the kind that includes yourself. The hardest person to make space for is often the one looking back from the mirror." Elena stood and moved to her kitchen with purposeful grace, returning with a small tin and a paper bag that breathed with warmth. "You are not a well, dear one," she said, pressing the tin into his hands. "Wells are measured by how much they give. You are a garden. Gardens are measured by how they are tended. Both provide, but only one remembers to bloom." Inside the tin, sugared orange peels released a scent that cut through the fog of his thinking with sunlight's common sense. The card tucked beneath read, "Return to yourself." When Morty tasted one, it carried the flavor of childhood summers and the patience of trees that knew how to grow slowly. Something in his chest unclenched for the first time in months. "I made a mistake," Morty said, the confession both small and huge. "I've been treating the library like a well I have to carry water from all day long. If I stop, the town will dry out. If I stop, I will." Elena's eyes held dusk-soft patience. "Help is a circle, not a line," she said, echoing words the librarian had once written. "You have forgotten that receiving is also part of the sacred work." That evening, they guided Morty through what Elena called the apprenticeship of self-forgiveness. Not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with the same gentle presence they had offered to Mrs. Kowalski, to the grieving family, to Lily with her sleepless nights. This time, the healing was more complex because it required Morty to receive the very medicine he had become so skilled at giving to others. When he finally allowed himself to visit the Library of Almost that night, it wasn't to borrow peace for someone else, but to find moments of self-compassion that had almost happened in his own life. He found them waiting on a front shelf, as if they had been expecting this visit. Almost forgave himself for not being everything all the time. Almost asked for help. Almost recognized his own worth without needing to earn it. The librarian with ink-stained fingers looked up from their work, their smile holding decades of patient understanding. "These are textures, not verdicts," they said softly, sliding a small card across the counter. "Return by integration, not by perfection." When Morty stepped back into his regular reality, the borrowed self-compassion settled into his bones like sunlight absorbed through skin. He understood now that the infinite heist had one more layer to reveal, sometimes the gentlest. Post-necessary theft was stealing back your own right to be cared for, to be imperfect, to need help without shame. Over the following days, the crew surrounded him with the same steady presence they offered to the world, but this time, Morty learned to receive it. Lena sat with him in comfortable silence, listening to stories his favorite books wanted to tell about the boy who used to read purely for joy. Marcus created spaces where Morty could simply exist without needing to be useful. Eleanor baked bread that tasted like permission to be unfinished, to have needs, to occasionally be the one who needed tending. The most profound change came in how Morty approached his gift. Instead of constantly seeking textures to borrow, he learned to check his own reserves first, to offer from abundance rather than emptiness. He practiced what Elena called the sacred pause, that moment between recognizing someone's need and rushing to fill it, where he could ask, "Am I the right person to help right now? Do I have enough to give without depleting myself? What would it look like to help from wholeness rather than from the need to be needed?" The stone from Lily still carried its warmth in his pocket, but now it was joined by Elena's sugared orange peels, by the memory of Marcus's unconditional presence, by Lena's patient listening to the stories his own belongings wanted to tell. The infinite heist had revealed its deepest secret, that sometimes the most radical act of love was learning to extend to yourself the same grace you offered to the world. As autumn deepened and Crewcoo settled into its gentler rhythms, Morty found himself moving through the town with a different quality of presence, still attentive to others' needs, still willing to offer the borrowed peace from infinite almost moments, but grounded now in the understanding that his own heart was also worthy of the space he worked so hard to create for everyone else. The crew watched this transformation with the quiet satisfaction of gardeners, witnessing a seed finally break through soil that had been too hard-packed to allow growth. They had helped him discover that healing others was beautiful work, but healing alongside others in community, with mutual support and shared vulnerability, was sacred work. That night, a salt air drifted through his bedroom window, and the ocean turned pages somewhere in the dark. Morty understood that he had learned the most important lesson the Library of Almost had to offer, that every act of kindness toward others was also an invitation to be kind to yourself, that every space created for hearts to breathe included the heart of the one doing the creating, and that the gentlest revolution began not with changing the world, but with learning to forgive yourself for being beautifully, imperfectly human. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for gentle intervention, new hearts that needed space to breathe, new textures to borrow from the infinite archive of almost peace. But tonight, Morty rested in the understanding that he was both gardener and garden, both fountain and source, both healer and one worthy of healing. Breathing easily in the space his crew had helped him remember how to create for himself, the lesson of learning to tend. His own garden alongside others' hearts settled into Morty's awareness like seeds, finding their proper depth in fertile soil. As autumn painted Crewcoo in shades of gold and gentle letting go, he began to notice something remarkable happening in the spaces between their intentional acts of kindness. Working from wholeness rather than emptiness had changed not just his approach but the very quality of what he could offer. The borrowed textures from the library of almost now attached more easily, took root more deeply, as if the town itself had developed receptors for the kind of peace that came from authentic abundance rather than desperate giving. Years passed like gentle waves washing over Crewcoo's shores, each season smoothing the edges of time while deepening the colors of memory. The crew watched their small acts of kindness ripple outward in ways that exceeded their most hopeful imaginings, creating what Elena began to call a teaching town, a place that had learned to offer its own form of education about the art of being gently human. Lily grew taller and steadier, her eyes still watchful, but no longer frantic with the hypervigilance of someone whose nervous system treated rest as dangerous luxury. She became a teacher in Crewcoo's elementary school, her classroom a sanctuary for children whose minds, like hers once had, spun too fast for comfort. She taught them not to suppress their anxieties, but to listen to the stories that everyday objects wanted to tell, to find lullabies hidden in the sound of wind through leaves, to make peace with shadows by giving them gentler names. Morty would sometimes see her on the beach, teaching a new generation of anxious children how to find smooth stones for their pockets, each one a tiny anchor against the tide of overwhelm. Her letters to Elena arrived regularly, written in careful looping handwriting. I taught my class how to listen to the hum of pencil sharpeners. They say it sounds like rain. The grieving family began returning every summer, not just seeking healing but offering it. The mother, her face still bearing the lines of profound loss but softened by years of gentle tending, would sit by the harbor knitting small blankets for new arrivals, her fingers weaving quiet understanding into each stitch. The father volunteered at the Maritime Museum, sharing stories of the sea with the same calm patience he had learned to apply to his own memories. They brought a shoebox each year, adding one of Lily's favorite small things, feathers, shells, a wrapper from candy she once called star sugar, to the collection beneath their bench, creating a shrine not to absence but to love that changes shape without diminishing. Even Rick's evolution reflected the town's subtle influence. His visits became less about dragging Morty into chaotic adventures and more about what he called quality control inspections, though everyone understood he was simply learning to rest. His inventions took on a different temperament, a kettle that refused to boil when a room felt overwhelmed, waiting instead until voices lowered, nightlights that learned the rhythm of children's breathing and dimmed precisely when bodies signaled readiness for dreams. Comfort devices disguised as vending machines that dispensed moments of ambient peace instead of sugary drinks. He called them psychological comfort units, grumbling about the market for calm, while secretly ensuring they found their way to hospitals, schools, and anywhere hearts worked too hard to feel safe. Mrs. Kowalski started a poetry hour in the library, reading Neruda without performance, a candle lit beside an intentionally empty chair, not to erase absence but to make it welcome. Marcus began hosting quiet hours in the park, where anyone could sit without being asked for anything, creating what he called soft exits that became public goods. Lena curated a listening table in the bookstore, where people brought objects holding stories their hearts were ready to hear, always ending sessions with the gentle question, "Is there anything we should put back?" The town's rhythm shifted in profound but ordinary ways. Shop owners left small gifts for each other, perfect shells, unexpected flowers, notes that simply said, "Thinking of you." The local newspaper included a section called Gentle Noticing, where residents shared observations about small kindnesses, creating a record of the community's growing capacity for tenderness. Elena's bakery developed a quiet custom. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, left in a basket for anyone in transit between hard places. The basket never stayed full and never stayed empty for long. Most remarkably, people began arriving who seemed drawn by something they couldn't name. A stressed teacher planning to quit her job found herself in Crewcoo during a weekend drive, spent 3 days learning to bake bread that tasted like patience, and returned to her classroom with a completely transformed approach. A retired nurse struggling with the transition from constant service discovered Lena at the bookstore, learned to listen to the stories her old medical instruments wanted to tell, and began volunteering at the clinic with renewed purpose. Morty understood that their work had evolved beyond individual interventions into something more systemic and self-sustaining. They had created what Elena called a field of gentle possibility, a space where kindness could take root and begin to grow independently. The town itself had learned to generate its own gentleness, no longer dependent on their constant tending, but capable of teaching visitors how to breathe without armor, how to rest without earning the right to be tired. The infinite heist had revealed its most beautiful secret, that stolen moments of peace, when shared with enough consistency and care, could teach an entire community how to generate its own tenderness. The textures borrowed from infinite almost moments had become soil in which real, present moment kindness could flourish and multiply. One evening, as the crew gathered to watch sunset paint the harbor in colors that felt like promises, Eleanor gestured toward the town with quiet satisfaction. "You see," she said, her voice carrying the soft authority of ocean tides, "the world does not need grand battles or loud victories. It needs quiet gardeners. It needs hearts willing to tend the small spaces, to make room for what wants to grow." Morty felt the profound truth of her words settle in his chest like warm stones. They weren't just helping others. They were continuously helping themselves. Each act of compassion, each moment of witness, deepened their own capacity for understanding, for patience, for love. The garden they tended was not separate from themselves, but an extension of their own growing hearts. The ripples were spreading now beyond their ability to track, carried by visitors who returned home with new stories, new ways of being gentle with themselves and others. Somewhere across the world, in places they would never see, people were learning to listen to everyday objects, to create soft exits from difficult conversations, to bake bread that tasted like forgiveness. As salt air carried the sound of laughter from families who had extended their stays, as lights came on in windows where people were reading stories aloud to each other, Morty understood they had accomplished something remarkable. They had taught a place how to become a sanctuary, not through grand gestures but through the patient application of attention, care, and the radical belief that every heart deserved space to breathe. The crew had become gardeners of possibility, and their garden was teaching other gardens how to bloom. In the growing dusk, with the ocean turning pages somewhere in the dark, they sat in comfortable silence, understanding that their gentle revolution would continue long after they were gone, carried forward by hearts that had learned the sacred art of making space for tenderness, to grow the understanding that their gentle revolution would continue long after they were gone, settled into Morty's awareness like seeds finding their proper depth in fertile soil. And as the months turned like pages in a book written by patient tides, he began to sense something shifting in the very texture of his gift. The familiar tingling that had once announced his slips between dimensions now carried a different quality, less like crossing a threshold and more like tuning into a frequency that had always been playing, waiting for ears that knew how to listen. It was during one of his visits to the Library of Almost, seeking a texture of patient waiting for a young artist struggling with self-doubt, that the librarian with ink-stained fingers looked up from their work with a knowing smile. They slid a ledger across the counter that Morty had never noticed before. Its cover plain except for a title written in that same tidy handwriting, "Those Who Make Room." Inside, the pages weren't lists, so much as small weather maps of tenderness, soft arrows crossing realities where people had chosen gentleness over cleverness at the exact same moment. "You are beginning to hear the symphony," the librarian said, their voice quiet enough to make the lamps lean in. Not just the individual notes, but the harmonies that play across all the spaces between heartbeats. Morty felt his awareness expand like morning light, touching the edges of a familiar room, revealing corners that had always been there but never quite seen. He could sense other versions of himself, other crews, other gentle souls who had discovered their own ways of making space for hearts to breathe. In a dimension where the coastal town was called Haven's Rest, another Morty worked with dreamweavers who helped people process trauma through shared storytelling. In a reality built around an inland lake, a different version of their crew had learned to heal through music that could literally tune hearts to frequencies of peace. The revelation came not as overwhelming chaos, but as gentle recognition. Like meeting family members you'd somehow always known existed. He learned to travel by texture rather than coordinates, arriving wherever the world was already humming the gentle tune he knew. In a desert town, Shade cloths fluttered like sails above a market, where people left jars of cool water under a sign that read, "Pause here." In a mountain village, the bell ringer sounded noon with a pattern that meant it's okay to be tired, and people stopped mid-task to look up at the sky, counting the long breath that followed. Elena appeared beside him in the library with her characteristic grace, carrying tea that smelled of jasmine and the patience of stars learning to shine steadily. "I have been part of this network for longer than you have been alive," she said softly, her words carrying the satisfaction of a teacher watching a student make a connection that had been waiting patiently to be discovered. "Since the first day you brought warmth back from that other classroom, I recognized the signature of someone learning to move gently through the infinite spaces." Over the following days, Eleanor guided him through what she called the apprenticeship of expanded awareness. The network wasn't organized in any formal sense, but operated more like a vast mycelial web, with understanding and support flowing naturally between nodes of kindness. Each texture he had borrowed from the library, each moment of peace he had facilitated, had been both individual healing and contribution to a collective reservoir of gentleness that existed across infinite realities. Lena began receiving what she called story echoes, narratives from objects in other dimensions, whose tales of love and loss resonated across realities. Her palm would rest on the bookstore counter, and she would go still in that familiar way before smiling, like a door had opened inside her. "They're humming the pencil sharpener song," she whispered one evening. And later, a letter arrived from a school 3 realities away, written in a child's careful hand. "Our class learned to hear the rain in the machine. We are less scared of tests now." Marcus felt echoes in his body, soft flashes of crowded rooms learning to follow a quieter center. "They're finding the exits," he would say, eyes distant, and then breathe in a way that made Crewcoo follow suit without thinking. His presence created ripples that extended far beyond physical proximity, his calm somehow strengthening the ability of gentle workers in distant realities to absorb the sharp edges of conflict. Rick appeared one afternoon with less fanfare than usual, his portal gun hanging at his side like a tool that had learned patience. He pulled out a small device that hummed with familiar warmth, no bigger than a coin, but carrying the weight of careful attention. "Built this to monitor the kindness frequency," he said, settling onto a bench that had been placed specifically for visitors who needed to rest without explaining why. "Turns out it's been getting stronger. Quantum kindness thing. Who knew?" The device vibrated once when distant places matched their cruise key, a reminder to lower the volume and take one long breath together. At what the librarian called the minute between minutes, they began to practice a synchronized softness. No messages passed, no choreography enforced. Just the agreement to pause wherever you happen to be and let the world catch up to itself. Across realities, invisible shoulders stepped down from their posts and turned their faces toward the window. Morty learned to leave a small sign when he had slipped through dimensions, a chalk drawing of 2 parallel lines with a comma and a tiny star. Never an instruction, always an invitation. Those who recognized it began to answer in kind. A bakery door in a rainy port wore the mark beneath a sprig of lavender. A subway pillar held it at knee height where children could see. Someone carved it into a park bench and rubbed it smooth, and strangers sat there without knowing why they'd chosen that spot and found their shoulders lowering by degrees. The infinite heist revealed its ultimate nature. Not a solitary practice, but a collaborative art, with gentle souls across infinite realities working together to steal back the world's capacity for tenderness. The crew was not a group, but a verb, existing anywhere people made room for hearts to breathe, even if no one called it that. Each small act of kindness in one dimension made similar acts more possible in others, creating a cascade of compassion that rippled through the fabric of existence itself. As evening light painted everything in shades of rose and gold, the crew gathered with the quiet joy of gardeners who had learned their plot was part of an infinite garden. They understood now that they were participants in a vast, loving conspiracy to make gentleness more possible everywhere, part of something eternal and ever-growing that would continue long after stars forgot their names. The ocean turned pages somewhere in the dark, and Morty felt himself held within the network like a note in an endless symphony. One small, steady participant in the infinite heist that was quietly transforming the fundamental nature of existence, one gentle breath at a time. The borrowed textures from countless almost moments had become seeds scattered across realities, taking root wherever hearts were ready to tend them, carried forward by the endless human capacity to choose love over fear, tenderness over toughness, connection over isolation. In the growing dusk, with salt air carrying the sound of laughter from families who had learned to extend their stays in places where gentleness was the first language, they sat in comfortable silence, understanding that the infinite crew would never end because there would always be hearts ready to steal back the world's forgotten capacity for grace, one patient breath at a time, the understanding that they were part of an infinite crew, scattered across realities but united in purpose, settled into the rhythm of Crewcoo's days, like morning light learning to paint the same harbor in endless variations. Years arranged themselves like seashells along the shore, each one carrying the soft spiral of memory, and Morty learned the art of growing older, the way the town had taught him everything else, patiently, with a hand extended to steady others, even as he allowed himself to be steadied. Elena's hair silvered to match her baking flour, and her hands moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned that every small gesture could be a form of prayer. She still rose before dawn to tend her ovens, but now she moved like tide reaching shore, unhurried, inevitable, carrying decades of witnessed healings in the steady rhythm of her work. The bakery had become more than a place of business. It was a living archive of gentleness, where the scent of cardamom and yeast mingled with something deeper, something that made every visitor remember what safety felt like. New souls found their way to Crewcoo with the same magnetic pull that had once drawn the original crew together. Nora arrived on a late bus, carrying anxiety like an overpacked suitcase, but within days she was learning to hear when a room exhaled. Setting down tea at the precise moment, conversations crossed from defense to trust. Jaime appeared with a torn kite and stayed to learn that mending could be meditation, his patient stitching coaxing stubborn tears into surrender before he discovered he could do the same with the rips in people's stories. Theo walked the town mapping what he called rest spots, bench slats that forgave tired spines, doorways where wind softened, patches of pier plank that held sunlight even on cloudy days. Morty didn't teach so much as a company, letting the work itself do the talking, quietly reminding them of the rule that had been their compass all along. Take nothing but heaviness, leave nothing but the space for hearts to breathe. He watched them discover their gifts with the same wonder he remembered from his own early days, when slipping between dimensions had felt like a secret the universe was whispering just to him. One winter morning, Eleanor left her flour-dusted apron on the back of a chair and a small envelope beneath a jar of sugared orange peels. Her tidy handwriting, steady as tide, had written on the envelope, "For when you need to remember that the infinite crew exists wherever someone chooses gentleness over cleverness." Inside, a single card read, "Return by inheritance," not the kind written in legal documents, but the kind that passes from heart to heart like seeds carried on wind. The bakery continued without missing a beat, as if Elena's presence had soaked so deeply into the walls that her absence felt more like a change in lighting than a loss. The bread still tasted like forgiveness, still carried the accumulated wisdom of every gentle intervention shared within those walls. Visitors still found sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, waiting in the familiar basket, and somehow the basket never stayed full and never stayed empty for long. Lena had grown into her gift, like a tree deepening its roots while reaching higher toward light. Her bookstore became a school for listening, where children and adults learned to hear the stories that objects carried in their hearts. She taught them not to drown in every memory they encountered, but to serve as translators, helping forgotten love find its voice again. Marcus became a quiet legend, appearing wherever conflicts needed soft exits, creating calm not through force, but through the simple power of refusing to add his own sharp edges to situations already full of cutting. Even Rick's evolution reflected the town's subtle influence. His visits had transformed from chaotic disruptions into what he called quality control inspections. Though everyone understood he was simply learning to rest, his inventions took on a different temperament. Streetlights that pulsed with calming frequencies, park benches that offered gentle vibrations to ease weary bodies, devices disguised as ordinary objects that helped rooms remember how to breathe. He grumbled about the market for calm, while secretly ensuring his comfort units found their way to hospitals, schools, and anywhere hearts worked too hard to feel safe. Summer's sketches filled an entire drawer at the bakery, clouds pouring invisible sugar into invisible cups, annotated with dates and weather notes, as if kindness were a science worth tracking. Their parents had mastered the art of small turnings, tools down 5 minutes earlier, laughter arriving without explanation, the way certain birds arrive at certain hours. The house had learned to hold their family's love in its walls, like sunlight absorbed through clean windows. As evening light slanted across the harbor, painting everything in shades of letting go, Morty found himself drawn to the pier where everything had begun. Not seeking textures to borrow or dimensions to slip between, but simply sitting in the space between day and night, between one breath and the next, letting the rhythm of waves remind him that some things were eternal, not because they never changed, but because they never stopped changing with perfect grace. Noor sat beside him, practicing the minute between minutes, her presence a calm that was learning to trust itself. Jaime had his mending kit open, thread catching the last light as he worked on a kite that would fly tomorrow in smaller hands. Theo held his map of rest spots, now crowded with small, hand-drawn stars marking places where weary hearts could pause without explanation. A child approached the pier's edge, wide-eyed, shoulders high, counting the gaps between planks like a secret method for not falling. Morty reached into his pocket and found Lily's stone, still carrying the memory of small hands, asking a too-busy world for a steady place to stand. "This remembers being still when the ocean was wild," he said, placing the stone in the open palm. The child nodded with the solemnity of someone receiving not an object, but a sacred trust. It felt right then to make one final visit. The library of almost opened not around him but within him, a change of attention rather than location. He didn't browse the shelves or seek new textures to borrow. Instead, he simply stood where he was and let the symphony rise, the faint, steady harmony of parallel crews choosing softness over spectacle, commas over periods, lullabies over alarms. He closed his eyes and let his message travel the way all true messages do, not with volume, but with sincerity so consistent it becomes its own kind of gravity. In every world where someone put down a tool 5 minutes early, where a teacher paused to let the room remember how to breathe, where a sandwich waited in a basket for a traveler between hard places, the phrase arrived like a star appearing exactly where you knew it would be, if only you looked up. The heist continues wherever you choose to be gentle. When he opened his eyes, the harbor was exactly as it ought to be. Boats nodded like good listeners. The first porch lights came on, turning the street into a constellation of everyday kindness. From the bakery's open window drifted the soft clink of cups and the low hum of voices reading aloud to each other, stories steadying themselves in the hands of people who had learned to hold without squeezing. Night gathered around the town the way a quilt gathers around a sleeper who has finally chosen to rest. Somewhere Summer's drawings rustled slightly as the bakery door clicked closed. Somewhere someone whispered the pencil sharpener rain story to a child, learning to find music in ordinary sounds. Somewhere else, a wind-up bird offered a single soft note because one note was enough. Morty felt no grand conclusion pressing on him, only the sweet, ordinary ache of a life that had learned to love its own weight. He was older, yes, but age here felt like a shoreline after tide, smoothed, shaped, carrying the memory of waves without needing to name each one. The crew didn't need instructions. They needed exactly what he had always offered: presence, a joke when one would help, silence when that would help more, a willingness to be human in front of each other without apology. He watched the dark become gentle rather than empty, and thought, with a gratitude so quiet it almost didn't need words, the space between is exactly where the magic lives. He didn't vanish or ascend. He did the most radical thing he had ever done. He stayed, breathing, teaching by example, letting his younger crew take the first steps and the next ones, ready to drift to the background like a lullaby you can still hear, even after you fall asleep. And if, once in a while, he tilted sideways for the length of a sigh to coordinate acts of kindness across the tender web of worlds. No one made it a spectacle. They just set another sandwich in the basket, left another small star in chalk near a doorframe, and trusted the tide to carry love where it needed to go. Somewhere, a child tucked a smooth stone under a pillow. Somewhere, a tired genius set down a tool and let water boil in its own time. Somewhere two people laughed at the same moment and didn't need to ask why. And here, on a pier that knew more about patience than any clock, an older man leaned back until the boards held him like an oath and let the sky finish what the day had started. A blessing that sounded like waves, like sleep, like the soft consent of a life that had chosen love again and again until it all became the only true habit, the infinite. Heist would never end, because there would always be hearts, ready to steal back the world's capacity for tenderness, one patient breath at a time. And with that gentle knowing, he stretched into the stars, understanding that the greatest adventures happen not in escaping the world, but in helping it remember its own infinite capacity for grace. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.